World War II and Hitler plunged the world into chaos, killing 70 million people. It seemed there was nothing the Nazis wouldn't do in pursuit of global domination.
The Nazis are everything that someone who's into conspiracy theories could possibly want in a villain.
History tells us one thing, but could that be wrong? Some believe it is, and that the real events have been covered up. On Conspiracy, the Nazis. Did World War II really mark the end of Hitler's reign of terror?
We are still legally at war with the Third Reich.
Did the Nazis devise a post-war Europe that even today could undermine Britain?
There are no parliaments, there are no democracies. It may not be Nazi Europe, but it's something too damn like it.
And could Hitler, history's worst mass murderer, have got away with it?
We were lied to. We're still being lied to. Adolf Hitler escaped. That's the headline.
In the world of the conspiracy, history isn't what you think. For 70 years, we've been told that on April the 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. But it's a version of history that conspiracists think is wrong.
We were lied to. We're still being lied to. Adolf Hitler escaped. That's the headline.
In late 1945, British intelligence published a report detailing what would become the officially accepted account of Hitler's death inside his Berlin bunker.
History tells us that Adolf Hitler, demented, betrayed, and lacking in any hope of victory at all, retires to his private quarters in the bunker with his wife, Eva Braun, and they commit suicide. Eva Braun probably taking a cyanide capsule. Hitler by shooting himself in the head. Those bodies are then carried upstairs and are put in a shallow grave, covered in 50 litres of petrol, set ablaze, and that's it. End of history. End of Hitler.
It's a version of events that most of us have accepted as the truth. Most, but not all.
What we have been told is duplicitous, deception, and a straightforward lie.
Gerard Williams is a journalist who has reported on some of the world's major conflicts, from the Falklands to Iraq. He's convinced Hitler's suicide is a fiction.
I believe that at the end of April 1945, the real Hitler, along with Eva Braun, was spirited out of the bunker where they escaped. Hitler did not die.
The first anyone knew of Hitler's death was on May the 1st, 1945, when German radio made a dramatic announcement.
Unser Führer Adolf Hitler ist gefallen.
It was the first clue, says Gerard Williams, that the death of Adolf Hitler wasn't what it appeared.
Hitler's death is not announced by the Allies finding his body. Hitler's death is announced by the German government, by the Nazis. The problem with that is, this is one of the greatest propagandist nations ever to run the earth. Hitler's dead, say us Nazis. And we are just meant to believe it.
Despite the radio report, the Allies were unable to verify Hitler's death. At the time of the announcement, the Battle of Berlin was still raging. A day after the broadcast on May 2nd, 1945, the Soviet army, accompanied by a BBC reporter, finally seized Hitler's bunker and made a grim discovery.
They found the body of a man with a lock of black hair on the right-hand side of his face and a little black moustache.
At first glance, it looked like the Nazi leader. But it was soon established that it wasn't.
And they looked at him more closely, and their doctors came to the conclusion that it was what they call a bad double of Hitler, and not Hitler himself.
Body doubles were widely used in the Second World War. Stalin was known to have numerous, and Churchill at least one. Historians are certain that Hitler used them too. It's not clear if the dead man was a Hitler body double or not. But the fact is, no one reported finding the body of the real Adolf Hitler in 1945. Sönke Neitzel is a professor of history at the London School of Economics. He studied the British report into Hitler's death.
So this is the official report by the British intelligence services released on the 1st of November 1945 on the last days of Hitler and Eva Braun. And here in the first paragraph it says, available evidence sifted by British intelligence and based largely on eyewitness accounts shows, as conclusively as possible without bodies, that Hitler and Eva Braun died shortly after 2:30 on April the 30th, 1945, in the bunker of the Reichschancellery, their bodies being burned just outside the bunker.
But with no body and relying only on German witnesses, some people simply refused to accept the report's conclusion.
Of course, this was a problem for the Allies. It would have been much better for them if they would have found a corpse. And this was one of the reasons why there is a myth about Hitler's death.
Rumors circulate almost immediately that Hitler's still alive, that he's escaped, that he's gone elsewhere. Nobody knows where he's gone or what happened to him, but he didn't die in Berlin.
And it was a suspicion shared at the highest levels. Stalin refused to believe that Hitler had died. And the same was true of Eisenhower.
Eisenhower is saying, we have no proof that Hitler died in Berlin. We hope he did, but we've got no proof. Stalin, Eisenhower, these are major players in the game.
And they weren't the only ones. Declassified documents show that agents from J. Edgar Hoover's FBI were still investigating sightings of Hitler months and even years after the end of the Second World War.
The FBI never thought Hitler was dead. They looked for him around the world.
The agency even went as far as producing a series of identity portraits designed to show agents what Hitler might look like in various disguises.
And I don't think that Hoover would have wasted any resources if he didn't think that he was chasing down one of the world's most wanted men.
If the FBI didn't believe it, why did we? The truth is, for several decades, many didn't. But then the Soviets dropped a bombshell. 23 years after news of his death first hit the airwaves, the Soviet Union admitted they'd had the remains of Hitler all along. History tells us that Hitler committed suicide in 1945. Despite there being no body, a British intelligence report based on German eyewitness statements confirmed his death. Then, in 1968, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union made an announcement that seemed to confirm the report once and for all. They admitted they had recovered the charred remains of Hitler and Eva Braun back in 1945. And claimed that an autopsy carried out in secrecy had matched a recovered jawbone to Hitler's dental records, while a skull fragment, complete with a bullet hole, confirmed the cause of death: suicide. But the Soviets' revelations, 2 decades after the event, seem rather too convenient for journalist Gerard Williams.
There are no bodies reported discovered in 1945. And this is something that amazes me. It's only in 1968 they said, well, actually 23 years ago, despite what we said at the time, we did discover the bodies of Adolf and Eva. And despite the fact that we discovered them, we didn't tell Comrade Stalin, who kept on saying that they'd escaped, and we couldn't be bothered to tell the American intelligence agency. We hid them. It just doesn't make any sense at all.
But for the rest of the world, for the next 40 years, the Russian announcement put an end to speculation that Hitler might have survived the war. Then, in 2009, the story was blown wide open again when an American pathologist ran DNA tests on a piece of the skull fragment held by the Russians.
The Russians say the skull and the jaw fragments that they own are Adolf Hitler's. And it's DNA tested, but they're not. They are that for a woman in her 40s.
The sensational discovery about the skull cast doubt that any of the remains the Russians claimed to have were Hitler's. Since then, the Russians have refused to allow anyone else access to the recovered remains.
There are no forensics, and none of it fits. We've been sold a dummy.
So why do people still believe that Hitler died in his bunker? To answer that, Gerard Williams thinks we have to go back to the British intelligence report written in 1945 by Major Trevor Roper, a professor of medieval history who'd spent the war decoding German messages.
Why would anybody put a professor of medieval history who has no experience in detective work, no experience in interrogation, to write the final report on the death of a criminal? No head of Scotland Yard, no senior detective, no senior military policeman, no man from the FBI, no forensics professor, a medieval historian.
Without a body, Roper's investigation was going to be difficult.
If you don't have a corpse, what do you do? So you have to interview the people, interrogate the people who were around Hitler.
And that's exactly what Roper said he did. But Gerard Williams doesn't believe him.
What's interesting for me is that when you read the accounts of the people who Trevor Roper said he interviewed, they say that he either never met them or they laughed every time they read what he'd repeated that they had said.
It turns out that Roper's report was actually based on statements given to Soviet interrogators, statements the witnesses later retracted.
We know that German prisoners, high-ranking prisoners who had been in the bunker, most likely lied to the Soviets when they were interrogated.
There are really serious problems with the official history. It's supported by eyewitnesses who actually never see anybody get shot, never see the Führer and Eva go into his private quarters in the bunker. They see bodies coming out, but nobody ever sees Hitler and Eva dead.
So, if the conspiracy theorists are right, and they did escape the bunker, what happened to them?
I'm pretty convinced that 2 people probably did die in the bunker at the end of April, beginning of May 1945, but they weren't Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. Hitler and Eva are substituted in the dying days of the bunker in Berlin. 2 double replaced them, and it was those who were murdered and their bodies disposed of later.
The conspiracy would have us believe that this audacious switch was masterminded by Hitler's private secretary, Martin Bormann.
To get to Hitler at any level at all, you had to go through Martin Bormann. Bormann controlled the door. He was the gatekeeper to him.
A committed Nazi, Bormann was determined to see his beloved Führer survive the war.
Bormann is a very committed person to Adolf Hitler. He's his friend, he's his leader, he's his Führer, and he wants to see him live. What he realizes is that if he wants to keep his friend alive and he wants to keep himself alive, is that they have to die. There has to be a final end to them. There has to be no reason for people to come looking for them.
And what better way to hide than to get your enemies to believe you're dead?
I believe that at the end of April 1945, the real Hitler, along with Eva Braun, was spirited out of the bunker to the Reich Chancellery. And that's where the exchange took place. The body doubles come back. And it's done. It's a sleight of hand.
Gerard Williams maintains that only Bormann and Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller knew about the switch.
The people who would have seen body doubles in the bunker for the short period that remained while they were still alive would have caught fleeting glimpses of Hitler in his uniform, Eva in her cotton dress. They would not have got close.
And when word reached Bormann that the real Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had successfully escaped, the body doubles were executed.
And that's it. End of history. End of Hitler. After those deaths, everybody is told that this is what happened. So you've got a bunch of juniors left with a story. And they tell that story to their interrogators because they believe it's true.
And these witness statements are the ones that the official report was based on.
If you tell a lie often enough and loudly enough, it becomes the truth. And in this case, what the world has accepted as the truth is this lie.
So if Hitler didn't die in 1945, where did he go?
There are rumors everywhere. Oh, you can see in a lot of the sort of gutter yellow papers of the time in America and in Britain, there'll be rumors of Hitler being discovered in the Antarctic.
The incredible theory proposed by renegade historian Douglas Dietrich is that the Nazis built a secret colony in the South Pole.
What was established was basing for initially 200,000 Aryans, constructed with underground factory systems, underground hospitals, even daycare facilities in which the Nazi leadership would retreat and be defended by a resistance movement and the remainder of its forces.
The creation of such a massive fortress in Antarctica may seem fantastical. But vast underground tunnels discovered in Austria at the end of the war are, some believe, proof that the idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds.
Diese Anlage ist mit fast.
This site is possibly the Third Reich's biggest underground site, with an area of around 1 million square meters.
Des Dritten Reichs.
Amateur historian Andreas Villa has explored this Nazi tunnel complex in Austria that was built to accommodate 60,000 men.
Es war wie eine unterirdische Stadt hier.
This was like an underground city. Everything you'd need was here.
The Nazis clearly had the engineering expertise. But did they build a similar complex 9,000 miles away in Antarctica? Some think they did. In 1938, the Nazis did send a team to the South Pole. They said it was for scientific purposes. But the man in charge of the mission was no scientist. It was Hermann Göring, the chief of the German Air Force.
One of the reasons for the Germans going to Antarctica was to acquire territory, because they had imperial ambitions. Germany felt that it had the right to claim a piece of Antarctica as its own territory.
But why commandeer land in one of the most inhospitable places in the world? Douglas Dietrich thinks he knows the answer.
The major point of that expedition was to establish the feasibility of long-term colonization of the last truly unexplored continent on Earth.
Fueling this idea that the Nazis planned to build a stronghold in the South Pole is a boast made by a top-ranking Nazi in 1943. Admiral Dönitz, the commander of the German U-boat fleet, is reported to have openly talked about an impregnable fortress in another part of the world that he claimed to have built for Hitler.
It would seem to me if he had built such a base, it would be much more likely to be in Greenland than it would be in Antarctica, simply because that's the theater of war in which Germany was fighting its major battles, not in Antarctica, which was several tens of thousands of miles away.
But the conspiracy theorists disagree. They say the arrival of 2 U-boats in Argentina, a staging post for the South Pole in June 1945, 2 months after the end of the war, is evidence that Dönitz fortress was in Antarctica.
The conspiracy theorist's idea basically is that there was a German base in Antarctica, it had been built during the war, and that the U-boats had gone to Argentina via Antarctica to take Nazi officials down to that base.
But the conspiracy theorists go even further. They believe the Americans had no doubt about the Nazi stronghold in Antarctica, and declassified documents released in the 1990s could back this up. They show that a year after the U-boats turned up in Argentina, Washington ordered a battle fleet to the South Pole. Conspiracy theorists claim the Nazis created a secret base in the South Pole from where they planned to fight on long after the fall of Berlin and the end of World War II.
The Allies realized that the German resistance was incredibly well organized and that they were faced with an extended resistance that almost certainly was centered on the Antarctic.
To support his claim, Dietrich points to a large US task force that was sent to the region a year after the end of the war. Conspiracists say the mission's sole aim was to destroy the alleged Nazi stronghold. But that's not the official story that was fed to the public in 1946.
The American public and the rest of the world was told that this was a mapping and weather expedition. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were obviously expecting combat because they had a single aircraft carrier which carried over 100 planes. They also had a submarine, they had 2 destroyers, they had 2 icebreakers, they had 1,000 aircraft. This was in no way a mapping expedition. Task Force 68 was sent to invade Antarctica to dislodge the Third Reich in exile from their new stronghold in Antarctica.
But can the claim made by Douglas Dietrich be backed up? Incredibly, it seems there is some truth behind it. Declassified documents now reveal that Task Force 68 was a classified military operation after all. The mission, codenamed Operation High Jump, was to train American troops in Arctic warfare, but not against the Nazis.
A new enemy had come on the horizon, and that new enemy was the Soviet Union. They didn't want to carry out a highly provocative major US Navy expedition in the Arctic because it would have provoked the Russians. So they went to Antarctica instead because the conditions were so similar.
So, declassified reports do prove that the Americans lied about Task Force 68's mission. But not for the reason conspiracists would like us to believe. So where does that leave the theory that the Nazis built a base in the South Pole?
It's a story concocted by people who have pulled little bits of information together from all over the place, bits of unrelated information, and they've stuck them together in a sort of montage that when you look at it and sort of squint, you can see, oh yeah, there might be something there, but really it's just a bunch of hogwash.
The Nazis were so extreme, so ruthless in their pursuit of global domination, that they've spawned any number of conspiracy theories that people are willing to believe. But even now, 70 years after the end of World War II, there is one enduring theory that just won't go away.
There's something about gold that just seems to provoke these sorts of conspiracy theories. And when you add the idea of heists and Nazis into that, you get a really potent brew that is very provocative.
During World War II, the Nazis systematically plundered Europe of hundreds of billions of pounds worth of art treasures and gold.
The Nazis were the world's biggest thieves. They took everything, absolutely billions. What most people don't actually realise is that something like $500 million worth of gold is still missing. So where is it? Who's got it? Probably stolen.
But who stole it?
There are rumors, there are stories that some of the gold was stolen by the Americans.
I personally believe that the US military were involved in the disappearance of Nazi gold and currency at the end of World War II.
In the last months of the war, advancing Allied troops in Germany and Austria had begun to unearth secret caches of loot the Nazis had stolen from countries across Europe. Hidden in castles, railway trucks and mines, tens of billions of pounds worth of art treasures, currency and bullion was recovered.
The Americans created special units they called T-forces, target forces. And they were tasked with going and seeking out gold, but also artworks and other valuables.
On April the 6th, 1945, at the Kaiserode salt mine in a small German village called Merkers, these American T-forces hit the jackpot.
The Merkers mine was truly breathtaking. It was compared to Aladdin's cave. It was a wonder to behold.
Inside the mine, they found some of Europe's most priceless antiquities, including artwork by Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Rembrandt. Over 8,000 bars of gold bullion and thousands of bags of gold currency. Virtually the entire contents of the Third Reich's treasury was recovered. The haul was worth the equivalent of £20 billion today.
Merkers was a massive find for the Americans because effectively it represented the majority of looted gold from all over Europe. It was by far the biggest find that they ever made.
The American T-forces were tasked with removing the gold and sending it to a secure foreign exchange depository in Frankfurt, where it would be processed and inventoried.
There are rumors, there are stories that some of the gold from Merkers did not make it to Frankfurt. That there was, I think as they say in the retail trade, shrinkage. That, so the implication is that some of the American soldiers tasked with evacuating the gold from Merkers enriched themselves. It's unconfirmed.
There is no evidence that any of the Nazi gold uncovered at Merkers was stolen by the Americans. But researcher Ian Sayer believes that similar caches did find their way into American hands. And he's dedicated most of his working life to proving it.
Here in this room, this is my Nazi gold archive, representing 40 years of work on the subject.
Ian's research concentrates on one particular find in June 1945. He's discovered that 25 cases of gold, worth close to £100 million today, were unearthed in a forest in Krun, in southern Austria. In 1978, over 30 years after the event, he interviewed the man in charge of excavating the gold, a US sergeant with the 10th Armored Division, Albert Singleton.
Albert Singleton said to me, I was responsible for supervising the removal of 100 boxes of gold from the mountainside at Krun and having it transported down the mountainside to have it loaded on trucks. Now, these trucks were operated by an organisation called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Service.
The OSS was the forerunner of America's Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and was created in 1942 to carry out covert warfare, sabotage, and spying missions. During a taped telephone conversation Ian Sayer had with Singleton in 1978, he confirmed that it was the OSS and not the American T-forces that took the gold.
The truck that came down to pick up the gold had the strategic services officers. There were 3 of them, and I remember making the comment, well, you sure as hell don't have many guards to guard this. And they said, look, we don't want to attract any attention.
At the time, Albert Singleton believed there was no reason to question the way the gold was being transported.
I mean, I just took things as an Army operation. We did it, and that was it.
According to Singleton, a telegram confirming that the gold had reached the Frankfurt Foreign Exchange was sent. But Sayer believes the operation was far from routine and claims the gold never found its way to the Frankfurt Foreign Exchange. It simply vanished.
My investigations could not establish that this gold ever made its way back to the depository where it should have been. So, in my opinion, it seems to have been stolen.
Despite a series of high-level investigations by both US military and civilian organizations, into the disappearance of Nazi gold at the end of the war, the Krongold remains missing.
It is almost impossible to extract any information per se about Nazi gold and missing Nazi gold from the American government.
There's no official documentation to say that the Krongold ever existed. But Ian Sayer has no doubts that Albert Singleton's story is true.
It's quite clear that although he's speaking about it 30 years later, it has the ring of authenticity about it.
If the gold did exist, and it was taken by US military personnel, why hasn't the US government admitted it?
The American government chose not to do anything because, as far as the army were concerned, they didn't want the American public to believe that the American army were involved in anything like that. There was a cover-up.
The truth about what happened to the Krongold may never be known. But there is another conspiracy theory that does involve other shady financial dealings at the end of World War II. Of all the Nazi conspiracy theories that are out there, one has particular relevance today. It's about Europe and the political clout that Germany has inside Brussels. This conspiracy says that Germany's financial muscle, and maybe even the EU itself, are the products of Nazi planning.
Germany sees its role as being the dominant player in Europe. It has tried this militarily and failed twice. After 1945, the Germans realized that real power is not taken at the end of a gun. Real power comes because you can buy it. And that's what happened post-World War II.
In the last years of the war, senior Nazis like Hitler's private secretary, Martin Bormann, recognized that the war was lost. And in 1943, after the failed German offensive in Russia, he set about planning an exit strategy.
Martin Bormann recognizes that Germany is finished. So he gets the key industrialists and the key bankers together and he says, we have to prepare for a Germany which is going to be defeated. And to do that, we need to look at this over a long period of time, move our money, move our patents, move whatever we can overseas, so that we can bring it back to rebuild.
Till recently, there was no proof that a real plan had been put in place. But now that's changed. This is a declassified US military intelligence report. It records details of a secret meeting that took place at the Maison Rouge Hotel in Strasbourg on August the 10th, 1944. It documents a conversation between key German industrialists and SS officers.
And here we have in the Red House meeting the final recognition that Germany was going to collapse, the Allies were going to win. Now, how would the Nazis and Germany and German imperialism reinvent themselves after the war?
It was a dangerous meeting to be at, really, because it was said at the meeting that, look, the game's up. We've lost militarily, but we're going to lay down our plans to continue our economic power after the Second World War, and well, this is how we're going to do it.
It's a historical fact that in the second half of the 20th century, the German economy thrived.
These same corporations who'd been so helpful to Hitler began to dominate the post-war world as well.
Today, companies like Krupp, Siemens and Volkswagen have grown into some of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world. Their influence and financial muscle, one of the major reasons Germany is so dominant in EU politics.
This new European experiment has as its centre Germany. And so it should. It's the biggest, most important economic operation on the continent. And that economic powerhouse is driven by the money they stole and the money they made during World War II.
Many disagree, but some are convinced that Germany's industrial clout today owes much to Nazi planning. One of them is Rodney Atkinson. The renowned academic and political economist has the ear of Nobel Prize winners and presidents. He's no conspiracy theorist, but nevertheless, he maintains that the EU also has its roots in Nazi thinking.
During the 1930s, the Nazi regime drew up their plan for a European economic community, which is almost identical to the structure of the European Union today.
Driving the idea was a man called Walter Funk, a key economic advisor to Hitler.
Funk himself was a leading Nazi who was responsible for a lot of the ideological extremism which Hitler adopted. He'd been responsible for the dispossession of the Jews. So he was not only a hardline ideologist, he was actually a practitioner of the Nazi policies.
In 1940, Funk published a paper that outlined his vision of the economic unification of Europe with Nazi Germany at its center.
In this paper, Funk lays out the steps that have to be taken to ensure what he calls a large unit economy will be built after the end of the war.
It could just be a coincidence, but in 1958, just 13 years after the Nazis' defeat in World War II, Funk's vision became a reality when the EEC, the forerunner of the EU, was formed. But Rodney Atkinson isn't convinced of this coincidence. According to him, the EEC wasn't just a Nazi concept, but an organization that was much, much closer to them.
Walter Hallstein was a leading Nazi under Hitler. He was a member of the Nazi Lecturers Association. Not something you can become a member of unless you're ideologically pure. And what did he become? Well, there he is, popping up in 1958 as the first president of the European Commission in Brussels.
So, could today's EU really be some kind of Nazi plan? A Fourth Reich? It's an idea that's easy enough to shoot down.
Well, there isn't a Fourth Reich clearly in the sense that there's no country that's a Nazi country. There's no genocide going on. There's no wars in Europe. But what there is a continuum of economic power from the major companies and corporations from the 1930s in Germany to the present day.
There's no denying Germany's dominant role in Europe today. Its influence largely down to its financial muscle. But whether or not this could be the result of Nazi-era planning and the industrial theft of gold during the Second World War is a matter of opinion. Some will believe the conspiracy, and others won't. But perhaps that's because the Nazis are a group that we still think are capable of anything.
In most conspiracy theories, the conspirators are these psychopaths, people who are bent on world domination at any cost, and they'll stop at nothing. They'll kill any number of people and commit any number of atrocities to achieve their ends. And so it's no surprise that we see so many conspiracy theories come out of the Nazi regime.
And Conspiracy's back with the Nazi King next Friday at 8. Laying down the law in his own unique way on 5 USA tonight, Longmire is the unstoppable sheriff serving up some old-fashioned justice. Catch the new season over there next. Whilst here on Channel 5, get ready for a whopping Big Brother shocker, live in just a sec.